hit record. Also, we'll begin by sharing the screen and reading the Parsha in a nutshell, which is the Parsha in short. So we'll see that we'll get the big stories, and then we figure out what we want to talk about and how we want to proceed. So here we go. Vayera in a nutshell. Vayera literally means, and God appeared to him. And the story begins, God reveals himself to Abraham 3 days after the first Jew's circumcision at age 99. But Abraham rushes off to prepare a meal for 3 guests who appear in a desert heat. One of the 3, who are angels disguised as men, announces that in exactly 1 year, the barren Sarah will give birth to a son. Sarah laughs. So that's the first episode, the opening episode. Then we read about the episode of Sedom. Abraham pleads with God to spare the wicked city of Sedom. 2 of the 3 disguised angels arrive in the doomed city, where Abraham's nephew Lot extends his hospitality to them and protects them from the evil intentions of the Sodomite mob. The 2 guests reveal that they have come to overturn the place and to save Lot and his family. Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt when she disobeys the commandment to not look back at the burning city as they flee. While taking shelter in a cave, Lot's 2 daughters, believing that they and their father are the only ones left alive in the world, get their father drunk, lie with him, and become pregnant. The 2 sons born from this incident father the nations of Moab and Ammon, who happen to be our cousins because they are the descendants of Lot, who's Abraham's nephew. They actually bordered the land of Israel, and because they were east of the Jordan River. Next episode, Abraham moves to Gerar, where the Philistine king Avimelech takes Sarah, who was presented as Abraham's sister, to his palace. In a dream, God warns Avimelech that he will die unless he returns the woman to her husband. Abraham explains that he feared he would be killed over the beautiful Sarah. God remembers his promise to Sarah and gives her and Abraham a son, who is named Isaac, Yitzchak, meaning will laugh. Isaac is circumcised at the age of 8 days. Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah 90 at their child's birth. Hagar and Ishmael are banished from Abraham's home and wander in the desert. God hears the cry of the dying lad and leaves and saves his life by showing his mother a well. Avimelech makes a treaty with Abraham at Beersheba, where Abraham gives him 7 sheep as a sign of their truce, which actually becomes the name of the city, Beersheba. You can go visit the city right now in the south of Israel. Beersheba, literally the well of the oath. God tests Abraham's devotion by commanding him to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Isaac is bound and placed on the altar, and Abraham raises the knife to slaughter his son. A voice from heaven calls to stop him. A ram caught in the undergrowth by its horns is offered in Isaac's place. Abraham receives the news that the birth of a daughter, Rebecca, to his nephew Bethuel. Why is that important? Because she's important because eventually she's going to be the one to marry Isaac. So, and that we're going to read about in the next week. So there's many episodes in the story, and the journey begins. Okay, so I think the best place to start, as always, is the beginning. So we'll start at the beginning. And the opening scene of the Parasha is Abraham sitting at the opening of his tent, Kechom Hayom, in the heat of the day. And why is he sitting at the opening of his tent? And why does God appear to Abraham? So it's very interesting. This is the first time in the Torah where it says that God appears to somebody without communicating a certain message, right? Usually revelation is God coming to a person and telling him a message. In this case, if you look at the Parsha it just says God appears to Abraham. Vi'era elav Hashem, God appeared to him, and he's sitting at the tent. So why did God appear to him? Why does God show up if he's not gonna say anything? He's not gonna communicate, right? Every other time in the Bible, certainly, I think in the 5 books of Moses, anytime it says that God appears, God is appearing with a message, even to Abraham. Last week, we read, God comes to Abraham and says, I'm going to give this land to your descendants. In a moment, in the next reading, we read how Hashem comes to Abraham and tells him about the city of Sedom. But here, God just appears without communicating any message. So why is God here? And that led the sages to say that why does God appear to him? Because there's no message to communicate. God is just coming to visit the sick. Abraham, after his circumcision, is recovering, and there's a mitzvah of healing the sick. So God comes to Abraham to visit the sick. That is what the sages say. You could see it in Rashi. I'm pretty sure. Yes, open Rashi. Vayera love, and the Lord appeared to him to visit the sick. That comes from Tanchuma, the Medrash. Said Rabbi Chama, the son of Chanina, it was the third day from his circumcision, and the Holy One, blessed be he, came and inquired about his welfare. So that's the Medrash. The Medrash says, again, why does God appear to Abraham? Because it was after the circumcision. If you remember last week, the last thing we read about, at least in the nutshell, was the circumcision. And now the story continues right after the circumcision. God appears and God is revealing himself to Abraham. And what happens, as you know, what happens while Abraham is sitting at the opening of his tent, he has three people show up, and Abraham goes and greets them, invites them. This is the great scene of Abraham being epitomizing the mitzvah of welcoming the guest, even though he's in pain and he's sick, and God is coming to visit him. But Abraham is running to greet the guests, who turn out to be angels, and they give him the promise about in 1 year he's going to give Sarah will give birth. Wonderful story. So one of the interesting questions that emerge in the beginning of this parsha, and we speak about it every year, but it's nice because it's a fundamental concept, is why does this parsha open up exactly at this scene, exactly at this spot? It seems like this is in the middle of the story of circumcision. You have the circumcision, and then you have Abraham healing from the circumcision. So Abraham healing from the circumcision, God coming to visit Abraham, should be logically a continuum of last week. So why would you split the story of Abraham exactly at this point? Remember, there were really two parshas. There are two portions that primarily focus on Abraham, last week and this week. You have to slice it somewhere. You have to divide it somewhere. Why is it divided exactly at this point? That is a question that many of the commentators raise. There are many different answers. The one I like best is as follows. The one I like best is because the reason why you split the story of Abraham into two, not just because you don't want it to be too long, there has to be a reason why it splits. So a lot of things change in this parsha. And one way to put it is this is now a different Abraham. You have the Abraham before the circumcision, and you have the Abraham post-circumcision. And they're not the same person. And because they're not the same person, they're separated into two different portions. So even though technically we're now beginning the aftermath of the circumcision, Abraham is ill and God is going to heal him after the circumcision. So it seems like it's part of the circumcision. No, make no mistake. It's a new person. It's the person. Abraham is at a completely new spiritual level. And therefore we begin this new parsha here. Where do you see that it's a new parsha? Where do you see that it's a new person? So the first thing we have to explain, and I think we say this every year, but it's still important to say again, is that the power of fulfilling a mitzvah, the power of fulfilling a commandment in Judaism is not just that the commandment is a ritual. My pet peeve, I can't stand when people refer to mitzvot as ritual, even though I commit the crime of doing that myself as well. I also could refer to it as ritual because that's when people understand what I'm talking about. But really, mitzvah is not a ritual. Why do I mean mitzvah is not a ritual? What does a ritual mean? A ritual means we do an action to remind us of something, to create a certain environment, to create certain memories. So we have a ritual. My kids say, I ask my daughter, what's your favorite season? The winter. Why the winter? Because it's going to snow and we're going to drink hot cocoa. Okay, because when it snows, you drink hot cocoa. That's the ritual. Okay, it's a wonderful thing. But that is not what a mitzvah is. According to Judaism, certainly according to the way it's explained in Kabbalistic and Hasidic writings, the purpose of a mitzvah is not just so we get together and we have a certain experience together and remind us of something of the past. But the mitzvah actually changes the substance of the physical object and of the world. In other words, if I do a mitzvah, every single mitzvah involves taking something physical and using it in a holy way. When I do so, I'm actually changing the physical object. The physical object becomes holy. I take a piece of hide, I write the Shema on it, I put it on the door, it becomes a mezuzah, now it's holy. And every mitzvah, in some sense, the job of the mitzvah is to bring the holiness into the physical world. And every mitzvah has that same theme. Now, this is a radical concept because spirituality and physicality are two separate things. How do you connect them? How do you connect God and something physical? It seems like there's a tremendous gap, and there is. And the answer is only God can do so. In other words, because God commands us to do the mitzvah, so a commandment is an empowerment. Basically, God says, if you do this, I will show up. If you do this act, I will come and sanctify that act. Which explains why in Judaism the focus is on action, because that's the purpose of creation, is to change the substance of the physical world. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because if you look at Abraham's life, up till this point, Abraham did not really have any commandments. This is the first commandment that Abraham has. Yes, he moved to Israel, but it wasn't that he has that God commanded go and do something tangible within the physical world. And the circumcision is the first thing that happens. So during the circumcision is the first time where Abraham is able to implement holiness within his physical body. The way we do it today after the giving of a Torah, but today we have 613 opportunities to bring holiness into the physical world. Abraham only had one because he only had one commandment. So what happens at this, by the way, and circumcision is actually a mitzvah where it's actually, you could see that it has a physically it has a tangible effect on the body. And that is really a metaphor for the spiritual effect of the mitzvah on the physical material with which you perform the mitzvah. Okay, so what am I saying? I'm saying Abraham has been transformed by doing a mitzvah. Before he did a mitzvah, the body, the physical world wasn't holy. He had a very holy soul. Abraham has a very holy soul, but his body is not affected. Once he does the mitzvah, his body is also affected. That's the philosophical point. Now let's see how you see this within the verses. And this is where it becomes absolutely beautiful. So what do we see? Verse 1. Now the Lord appeared to him in the plains of Mamre. God appears to Abraham. Wonderful. Okay, it's amazing. What happens? What's the result of God appearing to Abraham? And he was sitting at the entrance of the tent when the day was hot. The day was hot at noon, when the heat is, or afternoon, when the day is very hot and the sun is out. And he lifted his eyes and saw, and behold, there were three men standing beside him. And he saw, and he ran toward them from the entrance of the tent, and he prostrated himself to the ground. And he said, "My Lord," translated "my lords." This is an interesting translation. If only I have found favor in your eyes, please do not pass on from beside your servant. Verse 3 is an absolutely fascinating verse. Who is he talking to? Vayomar, and he said, Adonai. Adonai could be my Lord, it could be my lords. Who's he talking to? The problem with saying my lords, that he's talking to the three people who show up, the problem with that interpretation is after this point, everything else he says is in the singular. If only I have found favor in your eyes. But in Hebrew, the your here, be'einecha, in your eyes, the your is singular. He's only talking to one person. Please do not pass on from beside your servant. Your servant here too, me'al avdecha, not avdechem. Your servant, you are in the singular. So in verse 3, the second half, the entire verse, the second and third clause is talking in the singular. So therefore, it's hard to say that he's at the beginning. And he said, "My Lord," is he saying "my lords"? He's talking to the group, and that's why there's an opinion in the Talmud that says, you know who he's talking to? He's talking to God. He tells God, "My Lord," not "my lords," "my Lord. If I have found favor in your eyes, please do not pass on from beside your servant. Do me a favor. Hang on a second. I have business to take care of. I have to go and greet my guests." By the way, the sages say, this is a beautiful teaching, the sages say, from here we learn that greeting guests is greater than greeting God, right? Abraham has an audience with God. God appears to him. God appeared to him, and he's sitting at the opening of his tent. And now he has a choice. Am I going to continue my audience with God, or am I going to run and greet the three angels, the three people who I think we didn't know they're angels, the three guests? And Abraham tells God, hang on a second. I'm going to greet the guests. So what does that tell you? It's greater to greet guests than to greet God. Fascinating interpretation. We can elaborate upon that in a moment. But in any case, what am I trying to get at? I'm trying to get at, let's compare and contrast that to Abraham last week. What happened last week at the covenant between the parts when Abraham prophesies and God comes and speaks to him? So last week, what it says, when God appears to Abraham, first of all, I'm quoting chapter 15, verse 1. I'm just in the interest of time, I'm not going to find it inside, it'll take too long. But in any case, after these events, the word of Hashem came to Abraham in a vision. B'machazeh. A vision is not appearing. A vision is like a dream. So the revelation was not as powerful. That's one point. It wasn't as vivid. That's one point. But more important, Abraham falls asleep. If you look at verse 12 of chapter 15, and it happened as the sun was about to set, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham, and behold, a great darkness fell upon him. And he said to him, know with certainty that your offspring shall be aliens in a land not their own, and they will serve them, etc., etc. So this great covenant between the parts that happened last week happens when? It happens when Abraham is asleep. What does that mean? It means that when God appears to Abraham, he cannot be invested in the physical body using his physical senses. It's almost like his soul has to depart from the body in order to receive this great revelation. What happens after the circumcision? After the circumcision, God can appear to him in the middle of the day while he's interacting with other people. That's the big idea. The big idea here is he doesn't have to leave. He doesn't have to escape the physical world to feel the presence of God. Why? Because of the circumcision. What does circumcision mean? The mitzvah that changes his physical body, the mitzvah that makes his physical body refined and holy. And all of us are after the circumcision. In other words, we're all after the giving of a Torah. So the commandments that we do in this physical world affect our physical body to the extent that we're now like Abraham after the circumcision, in the sense that we could be sitting in the middle of the day and still feel connected to God. And we don't have to fall asleep to feel connected to God. In other words, in our daily business, we can feel connected to God. And that's a function of the commandments in general, specifically with Abraham. Abraham had it through the commandment of the circumcision, but we have it through every mitzvah. Every mitzvah that we do refines the body and therefore allows us to feel the divine presence while we are in the physical world, while we're interacting with other people. As opposed to other religions that say that if you want to feel close to God, other traditions, you have to escape, you have to meditate, you have to seclude yourself from society to be able to really feel a revelation. What is the Torah telling you? You know where Abraham feels revelation? While he's sitting in the tent, while he's interacting with other people. How is that even possible? Why isn't the physical world a distraction? Because he was able to sanctify and refine the physical world through doing a mitzvah. So that's the story. In short, that's introduction number one. Again, as always, if you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to jump in. Introduction number two. Again, why does the Parsha divide at this point specifically? So one way to think about the Parsha, and we talked about this in the past also a little bit, we touched upon this yesterday, but Abraham, according to in last week's Parsha and in general, Abraham symbolizes love. Last week's Haftorah and the reading of the prophets, we read that God refers to Abraham as Abraham Ohavi, the one who loves me. So Abraham represents the attribute of love. Abraham loves God. And he's in love with God. What are you going to do? If someone loves you and they say, please pack up your bags and move from Turkey to Israel, you're going to do it. And that's what Abraham does. And that's last week. This week, the second Parasha of Abraham represents Abraham's development. In what sense? So almost every major portion in this work, in this Parsha, in the second Parsha, shows you Abraham's struggle to connect to the attribute of discipline and awe, as opposed to just love. And you have it all throughout the Parsha. Of course, the epitome of that is the binding of Isaac. The binding of Isaac is Abraham has to not only bind and tie up his son, but he has to also tie up his attribute of love. It takes a tremendous amount of discipline and fear of God to be able to be prepared to do what he did. And in fact, when you finish the binding of Isaac, when Abraham, quote unquote, when Abraham passes the tests, God comes to Abraham, the angel comes to Abraham and he says, you should know, now I know I'm going to bless you. Why? Because now I know that you're God-fearing. Now I know that you're God-fearing. And that's a very interesting verse because you don't need the test of the binding of Isaac to know that Abraham loves God, right? Abraham and God already have a long-standing relationship. Abraham is deep within his career of spreading the monotheism, spreading the presence of God. Abraham is in love with God. That's not the question. The question is not if he loves God. The question is he in awe of God? In other words, could he be devoted to God beyond his own love? And that's the epitome, but you see it in so many other places. For example, the other very troubling story in this parsha, and we'll discuss that hopefully today, is sending away of Yishmael. Abraham does not want to send away his older son. Sarah says, you have to send him away. He's being a terrible influence on Isaac. And he doesn't want to do so. And God almost forces his hand. God forces his hand and says, listen to Sarah. And that's Abraham being forced to discipline. And that is something that is very, very difficult for someone who is as loving as Abraham to do. But probably the message of the parsha is that ultimately love alone is not enough to have a relationship, not a relationship with God and not a relationship with other people. Because ultimately love alone is an expansion of self. I love you because of what it does for me. I love you because how you make me feel. Ultimately, love comes back to the lover. And awe and devotion is about the other person, right? I'm doing it not because it makes me feel good. Discipline does not make me feel good, but I have to do it because of the other person. That's what the other person needs. And that's going beyond the self. And that's Abraham growing in that sense. And you'll see it, like I said, throughout all the stories of the Parsha, including the fact that he has to argue with God about saving Sedom. It's not easy to argue for someone who's all about love. And he does so. He's forced to do so because of circumstances, because he takes responsibility for his surroundings. But the bottom line is, this parsha could be understood to be as Abraham, who is at the epitome of love, learning to develop to also include the attribute of discipline. And that's the big picture. So that's the second introduction to today, to this week's parsha.
Can we go back to the first part where you were talking about the singular versus plural? And
yeah. So go ahead. Do you have a specific question, or you just want to?
No, in general. Yeah.
Okay. So we have a verse here, Vayomar. So Abraham is sitting. Now the Lord appears to him in the plains of Mamre, and he was sitting in the entrance of the tent when the day was hot. So Abraham is sitting, God appears to him. Abraham lifts his eyes, and he saw, and behold, 3 men were standing beside him. Okay, he runs toward them. And he said, my Lord. Again, it could be translated my lords, but in Hebrew, Adonai, my Lord. By the way, I want to give you a little bit of a background here. If you are a scribe and you're writing the Torah, there is a commandment against erasing God's name. So if you write God's name, you can't erase it. Now, what happens if you made a mistake for whatever reason? If it's God's name, you can't erase it. That's why, by the way, if you're becoming a scribe, if you want a career advice, if you want to become a ritual scribe, if you want to become a sofer, the first thing the sofer writes is the scroll of Esther. Why? Because the scroll of Esther is the only book that does not have God's name. And therefore, if you make a mistake, you can erase it and correct it. But if you're writing a Torah scroll, if you make a mistake, you can cross it out. But if it's God's name, you can't cross it out. Now the question is, there are a few words which we're not sure if it's God's name or not. This is one of them. Beautiful example. And he says, verse 3, Abraham said, my Lord, Adonai, who's my Lord? My Lord just means my Lord. If he's talking to a person, then it's not God's name. Then it's what they call mundane. It's chol, it's not holy. If he's talking to God, then it is holy. So there's a debate. This debate of what is the meaning of the word also has halachic ramification. Are you allowed to erase this word? But in any case, he's either telling the angels, telling them, please don't pass and come in. He's telling the guests, please don't pass, come into my tent. That's one possibility. If that's the possibility, then you have to contend with why is he speaking in the singular? And therefore the commentaries will say, the Medrash says, because he's speaking to the most prominent one of them. If there's three people, one guy's in the center, he's the most important, Abraham is speaking to that person. So that's one option to interpret. The other option is he's turning to God. And he's saying, God, if I find favor in my eyes, don't pass from me when I'm inviting my guests. In other words, what he's saying is, God, I'm going to deal with other people, but don't leave from my presence. Don't leave while I do so. What he's really saying is, don't let me lose the feeling of connection to you when I'm interacting with other people. This reminds me of a very interesting interpretation from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory. So he says like this. He says that the famous words that man is created in the image of God is written twice in the Torah. Once it's written in the creation of man, that God creates Adam in his own likeness and in the image of God. That's where it says it once. But then it says it again. Where does it say it again? It says it again after the flood. After the flood, there's a commandment. God tells Noah that he's allowed to eat meat of animals. He says you can't eat, you have to kill the animal first. And then he starts talking about just because you can eat a animal, he reiterates the commandment against murder. You can't kill a person. Why can't you kill a person? Because every person was created in the image of God. That's what the verse says. So that's the second time it says it. So what does Rabbi Jonathan Sacks say? It's very interesting. He says, the first time we read it in the Torah, we know the person who's created, was created in the image of God. Wonderful. The second time it says it a little bit deeper. It says, when you look at another person, you can't kill another person because he too was created in the image of God. In other words, this first step is recognizing that I'm created in the image of God. The second step is recognizing that when I look at somebody else, I'm looking at somebody who has a spark of God, who's created in the image of God. In other words, could you see God in the other person, not just in yourself? And maybe this is the same thing that's happening here. What Abraham is saying, when I interact with somebody else, I am not going away from the presence of God. I'm in the presence of God when I'm helping somebody else. Because what is another person? Only an extension of God. So a little bit philosophical, but I think that's what I think about when I read these two interpretations.
Thank you.
Rabbi?
Yes.
If you go back to verse 1 as versus verse 3, Lord is translated, it's written in Hebrew differently. Could you discuss that, please?
Okay, so in general in the Torah, so you're pointing out that over here, Vayera Hashem, now the Lord appeared to him. This is not, again, the best translation. Our scroll usually writes Hashem. Here it says Adonai, which is my Lord, which is translated as my Lord. Our scroll translates it. I wonder how they translate it. Typically, they translate Lord, if it's referring to God, as God, Hashem and God. Without getting into too many details here, it's clear that the Torah has multiple names for Hashem, at least 7. Why are there different names for Hashem? So the interpretation is that you can't really name God because God defies description. A name is a description. God defies description. So what are we naming? We're naming what we see of God. In other words, God is referred to by his actions. In other words, if God is performing kindness, we say, wow, you're God, we call him kind. If God is performing judgment, we call him the judge, etc. In other words, we're not saying this is what God is. We're saying that this is the expression of God. In other words, God is expressing himself in this way at this time. And therefore, there are different names reserved for different attributes. So if God is acting as in judgment, it's always going to say Elohim. Elohim could be, it means judgment, and it actually in the Bible could also refer to human judges, because it's the attribute of justice. And then, so every name represents something. The greatest name, the most sublime name, the most transcendent name is the name of the four letters Yud Hey Vav Hey, which we do not pronounce because it's so holy. And that is the most transcendent name. It probably either comes from the word creation, that he creates or sustains, but it also comes from the word, it's really a merging of three words of Haya, Hoveh, V'yeh, was, is, and will be, past, present, and future, all in one word. So that basically tells you that you want to know what God is, we don't understand, but I'll tell you what he is. He transcends time. For him, past, present, and future are the same, all in one. Now that's enough for us to know that we cannot understand that, because everything we understand is within time and space. And once we can't really go beyond time and space. And God transcends time and space. So that's the greater revelation. And if you're going to say that Adonai, this case of Adonai, my Lord, refers to God, then that's already God that's already God doing a specific act. And usually Adonai is more judgment. And the reason why there's a judgment here is because, first of all, this entire parasha is about judgment, but specifically, this is really a scene of judgment, because from here, the angels are going to go to Sedom, and Sedom is going to be overturned because of their wickedness, because they outlaw charity and outlaw hospitality. So the commentaries say that these two scenes, one after the other, of Abraham sitting and inviting guests, even when he's in tremendous pain. And the next story is going to be how the entire city of Sedom surrounds Lot's house to destroy the house because he invited two guests. These two scenes are really a part of a greater picture, a greater story, the story of judgment. And Abraham is blessed because of his inviting of the guests, and Sedom is doomed because they try to kill the guests, because they outlaw hospitality and charity. And why is Lot saved? So you say, well, Lot was saved because he has connections, nepotism, he's Abraham's nephew. That's not really why he was saved. Why he was saved? He was saved because he passed the test. He was saved because he was the only one in the city who's willing to invite guests. So in other words, this whole scene is really a scene of judgment. And that's why perhaps it says Adonai, referring to God as the God of judgment, because this really is, once you get into the story, it's really a scene of judgment.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. One other thing, I know that I'm holding you back a little bit, but is it believed that Abraham actually circumcised himself?
That's a very interesting story, because the short answer is yes. Short answer is yes. There's a mystical answer that says no, because there is a verse that says, it's in the passive form. On this day, Abraham was circumcised. So there's two ways of reading this. One interpretation is that because he's old, he needs help, and God helps him. That's what the Medrash says. But what is the Medrash really saying? So the Hasidic commentary explains that when we do circumcision, we're removing part of the physical body, the cover, so to speak, and we're removing the concealment. But then if you look at the book of Deuteronomy, and at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, it says that eventually, when Mashiach comes, God is going to circumcise the heart. In other words, God's going to remove the blockage of our heart that stops our heart from responding in love and awe of Hashem. In other words, now there's a certain cover on our heart. We're not always sensitive to spirituality the way we should be. And in the end of days, God will remove the covering, which means remove the evil inclination, and he'll circumcise the heart. That's the word that is used. So in other words, in every circumcision is the part that we do. We circumcise the body, which is the beginning of removing of the negativity. But ultimately, we can't remove it completely. We still have evil, we still have free choice, we still have negativity, we still have evil inclination until God removes it from us in the end of days. So what the Kabbalah says with Abraham, it says Abraham was circumcised because God circumcises his heart when he circumcises his body. So that's why it's written in the passive form that Abraham was circumcised, not that Abraham circumcised himself. So you touched upon a whole Kabbalistic interpretation. So I felt we should at least you hit a gold mine. So here it is. That's the story in short.
Thanks, Rabbi.
That's a Hasidic discourse that Rabbi Shneur Zalman, the founder of Chabad, wrote, and it's very common that if you go to a circumcision of a Chabad family, that they repeat a discourse of Hasidus by the circumcision, but you have to stay late, because if you just come and you watch a circumcision and you do the mitzvah of eating and then you check out, you're going to miss the discourse. But if you stay long enough, you're going to hear the discourse, and this is going to be the discourse. This verse that on this day Abraham was circumcised. So that's the short answer. The short answer is he circumcised himself, but the Medrash says he has help from God. But Kabbalistically means that he didn't just circumcise his body, but also his heart. He was circumcised. Because it's interesting when it comes to, at the end of last week's Parasha, it says that Avram circumcised his whole family, all the people in his home, and that Avram himself did it. And then it says he was 99 when he was circumcised. Okay, that's enough for circumcision. Let's move on to Sedom. Sedom was a fascinating city, a fascinating place. One of the reasons why it's so fascinating is because the Torah is obsessed with Sedom. There are 3 times in the stories of Abraham where Sedom is discussed. And it is something strange about the city of Sedom. In short, it's a very prosperous city. Last week we read when Lot decided to go to Sedom. In Israel, it's the most fertile place. There's water because it's in the valley of the Jordan, and it's got plenty of water, and it's like Egypt. It's like the garden of God, like the land of Egypt. It's so everything that grows there so beautifully, and the people ultimately are wicked. Why do we know? The verse keeps reiterating how the people are wicked and how they don't. The verse doesn't say so explicitly, but we know that they outlaw charity, and it was illegal to give charity, and that we see from the story when the two angels come to Sedom and Lot invites them. The whole city surrounds the home to break it down, and to break down the city, to break down the home, to punish these two guests, because you can't be a guest in the city of Sedom, and ultimately it's overturned. But what's interesting about the Sedom, according to certainly the Kabbalists and others as well, Sedom is painted here as all bad. But if you look carefully, you will see that Sedom is not all bad. Why? Because ultimately, what emerges from Sedom? Long story short, Mashiach, the king, the Jewish king, who will ultimately bring salvation to the entire world, in other words, bring peace and perfection to the entire world, Mashiach comes from Sedom. How so? Because Mashiach comes from King David. King David comes from Ruth, the convert. She was a convert from Moab, and Moab is a direct descendant of Lot's daughter, and they were speared from Sedom. So Mashiach, who's going to save the entire world, bring peace and prosperity to the world, comes from Sedom, but Sedom was a wicked city. That's a very strange phenomenon. In fact, the Medrash makes this point. There's a verse in Psalms that says, Matsasi David Avdi, I found David my servant. In other words, God found David because David wasn't the candidate that you would expect to be the king, but God found him. In other words, it was unexpected. But the Medrash says we're not just talking about David, we're talking about David's descendant Mashiach. And God says, I found David. You know where I found him? I found him in Sedom, in the wicked city of Sedom. Why? Again, because David and his descendants and Mashiach come from Ruth, who's really a convert from Moab. So here we have something very interesting, where Sedom itself is a symbol of wickedness, but yet they're going to be the ones to heal the entire world. So that leads us to say that Sedom really, truthfully, they have a kernel of truth, but of course the way they did it was terrible, and therefore it ended up to be very evil. And there's many ways of talking about this. I'm going to talk about this in the practical sense, and then maybe in the Kabbalistic sense as well, but we'll start with the practical. How do you get to a society where the people outlaw charity? They don't begin as evil people, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So it comes from a good place. So the Hasidic commentaries explain something fascinating. Let's look back at the history of the stories in the Torah. So you start with the terrible corruption of the generation of the flood. Generation of the flood, the world was filled with robbery. Mala haaretz chamas, the world is filled with robbery. Because the world is filled with robbery, therefore, God says, I'm destroying civilization. Because you can't have civilization if everyone's robbing from each other. In other words, what was the sin of the law of the generation of the flood in simple English? In simple English, the sin was they did not respect private property. That's it. So what happens in the aftermath of the flood? There are people that say, you know what? We don't want to degenerate to a place where people do not protect private property. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to go to the other extreme. We believe in private property to the extreme. What does to the extreme mean? What's mine is mine. What's yours is yours. We don't allow charity, because what does charity mean? Charity means I'm giving you what belongs to me. Ultimately, they said, if you give charity, there's a slippery slope to theft. Because what happens? If I give charity to the poor, it's because I say the poor is entitled. Well, if the poor person is entitled to my charity, then maybe he'll break into my house and take it. Or maybe he'll send, make us send a militia to take it. So in other words, they feel that if charity is actually immoral, because charity is a threat to private property. And if you don't respect private property, you're going to end up with a generation of the flood where people don't respect other people's possessions and the earth is full of robbery. So that's their argument. That's a very beautiful argument. So what do? They move to a place, they want to create a society where there's no charity. So you know what they do? They move to a place where there's plenty, right? There's plenty. It's very fertile. Economy is wonderful. Whoever lives here, we're going to make a gated community. That's really what it is. It's a gated community. Within this gated community, there's no charity allowed. Why? Because we're creating the Messianic era. We're creating the utopia. We're creating a place where there's no need. Now, when the world is not perfect, so it only applies to a few square miles. But in these few square miles, we want perfection. Perfection means there's no need. If there's no need, there's no charity. And we don't want to say, oh, we should give to other people, because if we give to other people, that's an assault on private property. And we saw what happens when there's an assault on private property. We ended up with the generation of the flood where everybody becomes corrupt because everyone's involved in theft. So what do? You see that their argument is actually a rational argument. It also comes from a place of justice. They want to do what's right, and they're afraid to come to a place to create a society where people don't respect private property. But what they did is they took the private property to the extreme. That is the problem with Sedom. Now let's see what the solution is to where their mistake was and where that mistake is alluded to in the Torah. So there's a very beautiful verse, relatively famous verse, very beautiful verse, that we actually must look inside and see, because it's too good not to look at. So this is verse right after the men, the guests show up. They told Sarah, you're going to have a child. Now verse 16. And the men arose from there and they looked upon Sedom, and Abraham went with them to escort them. So they're moving towards Sedom. Avram's escorting them. Now God says, what's going on here? If I'm about to destroy Sedom, I must consult with my friend Abraham, right? Because imagine your friend does something radical and doesn't call you, doesn't tell you about it. So you're going to call them up tomorrow and say, how could you do this without telling me? So that's what God says. Can I not tell Abraham what I'm about to do? Verse 17, and the Lord said, shall I conceal from Abraham what I am doing? Abraham's a great guy. And verse 18 and 19 is sort of God praising Abraham. And because saying Abraham is so great, therefore says God, I can't do anything without consulting with him. Okay, fine. Verse 18, and Abraham will become a great and powerful nation, and all the nations of the world will be blessed with him. Will be blessed in him. Okay, verse 19. Why does God love Abraham? You ready? So you're going to say, well, because he discovered God. No, that's not in this verse. Well, because he educated the entire world. No, it's not in this verse. What? He took care of his family, taught his family morality. So here we go. Verse 19. For I have known him because he commands his sons and his household after him, that they should keep the way of the Lord to perform righteousness and justice, in order that the Lord bring upon Abraham that which he spoke concerning him. This is a very fascinating verse, because you would say Abraham introduces the concept of monotheism, the concept of God, to the entire world. But some people who are thinking about the world forget about their own family. And Abraham was not that way. Abraham understands, and that's what God says. You know why I love him? You know why I have known him? But in Hebrew, known is a synonym for being intimacy. Why God is in love with Abraham? Because he teaches his children and his household, people closest to him, to follow the ways of the Lord. Okay, fine. And what do they do when they follow the ways of the Lord? So here the verse says, La'asot tzedakah u'mishpat, to perform righteousness, not a perfect translation. Tzedakah, you know what tzedakah is. Tzedakah is charity. To perform charity and justice. Okay, charity and justice. Charity and justice seemingly is a very bad combination. They're not the same thing. They're almost opposite. Charity and justice are an opposite. So why does God pack them in together? Why are charity and justice opposite? Because what does justice mean? Justice means you give each person what they deserve. What does charity mean? Charity means you give the person even if he's not deserving. So what is it? Is it charity or justice? How could you have charity and justice both together? So here we go back to the mistake of the people of Sedom. Justice is synonymous for private property. That's justice. It's mine, that's yours. We each have our own private property, that's justice. But to what Avram understands and what Sedom doesn't understand is that the whole purpose of justice is to do charity. In other words, why does God create private property? Why does God say this is yours? And it's yours and no one could take it without permission. It's yours. It's yours so that when you shear, it would be considered charity. Because remember, if it's not mine, then if I give it to you, it's not my mitzvah, right? That's the problem. That's the problem with socialism. If you have a world of socialism or you have a world with absolute private property, there's no kindness. And the whole world was created for kindness. But what does kindness mean? Kindness doesn't mean that the government taxes me at 99%. Kindness means the opposite, that it's mine, it belongs to me, it does not belong to the collective, yet I decide of my own free will to give from that which is mine for somebody else. That's kindness. But if it's not mine, it's not kindness. So you're not going to have kindness if you have no private property or absolute private property. The only way you're going to get kindness in Abraham's model is if you have tzedakah u'mishpat, charity and justice. Justice means private property, but the purpose of the private property is so that charity will be possible. So now we have the big picture. Now we understand the mistake of the generation of the people of Sedom, but we understand where it came from. It came from a good place. It came from protection of private property, so we don't degenerate to the generation of Sedom. So that's the political. That's the economic explanation of why Sedom was started out in a good place, and why when Mashiach comes, we'll be back from Sedom. In other words, Mashiach comes from Sedom because ultimately, what Mashiach does, it creates a world where there's no need. If there's no need, you can create like Sedom. If there's no need, you can outlaw charity because there is no need. So eventually we're going to get to that point, but now it's obviously way too premature. That's the sort of the political explanation. There's also a Kabbalistic interpretation, but I don't think we're going to have time for that. I still want to do one more story. So we'll take Vicky's question, and then if I have 5-6 minutes, we could discuss one last episode, the episode of Sending Away of Yishmael, which is a very troubling episode, but we have to address it. Go ahead, Vicky.
I got a question about that explanation. Can we take it a little bit like step up and emphasize not the economical implications, but spiritual? Because no society is wise enough to make their own rules that will supersede the wisdom of Torah. So the fact that Abraham is walking the God's way, so he's taking his wisdom from Torah. Right. That's why he cannot make a mistake.
You're correct.
And that's why and that's why no society can invent their own rules. Even if today we can come up with something even more clever, we still cannot supersede that wisdom.
So you're saying something very true. You're saying Abraham didn't necessarily come up with this genius on his own. The way he got it because the verse says, "V'shamru derech Hashem." This is the path of God, right? The path of God is kindness and giving. And Abraham understands that obviously, if you have this situation in Sedom, in the generation of the flood, where there is no private property, nobody respects private property, then I'm not giving because you're just coming in and taking it from me. So that's not giving. If you have Sedom, where nobody gives at all because we have private property to the extreme, then there's no giving. So Abraham looks at the ways of God and understands that God is all about charity. But for charity, you need justice. All I'm trying to say that's embedded in this verse, La'asot tzedakah u'mishpat, this contradictory term, justice and charity, which is contradictory, as I said, because justice means you only get what you deserve, and charity means you get even if you don't deserve. So how could they both be fitting together? Because that's the model of God. The model of God is God doesn't have to give you, but he chooses to give you. That's the model of charity. It's mine because the Torah believes in private property, and yet the Torah says not only Torah doesn't outlaw charity, the Torah says you should morally, you have to morally. No one's going to force you. It's yours. It's your stuff. And therefore, if you give it, it's kindness. Remember, if the Torah says it's not yours, then if it's not yours, then it's not charity. Right? So that's an interesting, I think, fascinating way of looking at this entire story. There's Kabbalistic ramification for that. Come back in 1 year from now, God willing, in good health. Come back, same time, same place. We'll do the Kabbalistic idea of what the city of Sedom represents and why it will be rebuilt. By the way, I forgot to say, the verse in Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel says that God says he's going to rebuild Sedom. In other words, Sedom has to be this, their thought process, their energy has to be rectified. In other words, the ability to create a place where there's no need, that's a very, very powerful place to be. And it's an origin, it's a very good place. The way they played it out is bad, but that's for another time. I want to get to the story of the binding of sending away of Isaac. Terrible, terrible, troubling story, but sending away of Yishmael, but we got to do it because it's in the story. And we never get that far in the Parasha because we only have 1 hour. So maybe today we'll skip right to there. Okay, I have 4 minutes. Let's see if we can do this in 4 minutes. No, gotta go here to the 5th reading. Okay, beautiful. Abraham is 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has made me joy for me. Whomever hears will rejoice over me. Everybody's so happy, wonderful. Isaac grows up, verse 8, and the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Okay, here is the problem. And Sarah saw that the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had born to Abraham, was making merry. I have no idea what making merry is. Bad guy, bad influence. I don't want the son. As Sarah says, remember, there's another wife and another woman in the house, because when Sarah could not have children, she tells Abraham to marry her maidservant Hagar, and her maidservant Hagar gives birth to Yishmael, and we had some tension with her last week, and now it all blows up with when Yishmael is about 13 years older than Isaac, 14 years older than Isaac, and now he's being a terrible influence on Isaac. Sarah says, we got to get rid of this guy. Sarah said to Abraham, drive out this handmaid and her son. Garesh, chase her away. That's really what the word means. Garesh, drive out, chase her away, divorce her. Garesh is the same word used for divorce. Drive out this handmaid and her son, for the son of this handmaid shall not inherit with my son, with Isaac. But the matter greatly displeased Abraham concerning his son. This is the bad translation. Vayera hadavar, it was bad in his eyes. In other words, to do this, to send away his son, it was bad, very bad in his eyes. He couldn't do it. God intercedes, and God said to Abraham, be not displeased concerning the lad and concerning your handmaid. Whatever Sarah tells you, hearken to her voice, for in Isaac will be called your seed. In other words, Isaac is your main son. However, but also the son of the handmaid I will make into a nation, because he is your seed. Okay, what's happening here, and what does this mean in our life, and what's happening here, and what's the big picture? So Sarah appears like this woman who doesn't care about Yishmael, doesn't care about Hagar, just cares about her own son. So in short, the way the Hasidic explanation deals with this is as follows. Abraham and Sarah both have a mission, and they're a very good couple, and they're in love, but because their mission is different, therefore their attitude toward Hagar and Yishmael is different. Abraham's spiritual mission is to be, as God said last week, God changes his name from Avram to Avraham, adds in Hey, the letter Hey, which makes the H sound. And the letter Hey means Hamon, multitudes of nations. God tells Abraham, your mission statement is to be the father of many nations. Abraham's spiritual mission is to affect the entire world. Abraham can't send out Yishmael because Yishmael is not living up to the ideals of Isaac, right? Abraham has a responsibility for all the people of the world. That's Abraham. What's Sarah's mission? Sarah's mission is not universal. Sarah's mission is to give birth to Isaac and to protect Isaac, to allow him to grow into the Jewish people. In other words, if Abraham is the father of all of humanity, He's the father of many nations, as we said last week. Sarah's job is to cultivate the Jewish nation. And the Jewish nation has different standards than the rest of the people. Therefore, when it comes to the story of Yishmael being a bad influence on Hagar, so Sarah says, you have to get rid of Yishmael because Yishmael is being a bad influence and he's blocking Isaac living up to his full potential. And my job is to create the Jewish people. The Jewish people have to be, in some sense, separate and apart from everybody else, because we have to put up some boundaries and maintain our own spiritual standards. Abraham doesn't want to do it because Abraham says, I have responsibility for the entire world. And that's the conflict. And here it gets interesting because God intercedes. It seems like God is interceding and supporting Sarah, but it's not as simple. It's not as simple. Really, what God is doing is God is supporting both. And I'll show you that in the verses, which is very interesting. What God is saying is he's saying, Abraham, of course you have to influence the whole world. But before you could influence the whole world, you have to cultivate the Jewish people. In other words, Sarah is right. Just because you have to influence everybody, that doesn't mean that that Isaac, you have to sacrifice Isaac's unique identity. So you have to protect Isaac's unique identity, and that becomes first. And once you do it first, once you build the Jewish nation, then you will be able to influence the rest of the world. But if you have this conflict between as our responsibility to protect the Jewish people, in other words, to influence the Jewish people or the rest of the world, the answer is, while Abraham is more universal and Sarah is more particular for the Jewish people, the answer is both. But the way it's done is first you have to protect the Jewish people and make sure they're living up to the right standards, and then you can influence the rest of the world. So who's right? Sounds like God says Sarah's right, but it's not true. It's not exactly so, and I'll show you in the verses why it's not exactly so. First of all, what does God say? God says, whatever Sarah tells you, do. For Isaac will be called your seed. But then that's not where he stops. God continues. But also the son of the handmaid, I will make him into a nation because he is your seed. So he's not saying divorce. Sarah says, chase him away, divorce him. God says, yes, send him away. Do what Sarah says. But he's still your seed. He's still your child. You still have responsibility for him. And therefore he's going to become a great nation. And by the way, we know ultimately Yishmael comes back and does teshuvah, and so does Hagar, but that's the next parsha. Where do you see this even more clear? Let's look at the words that Sarah says. Sarah says, Vatomer Avram, and Sarah said to Abraham, drive out this handmaid. I said that the word garesh, chase away. The word garesh means divorce. When you want to divorce a woman, it says, the Hebrew word is gerushin. You divorce, but divorce is to send away. You're cutting all ties. What does Abraham do? Abraham does not do that. Sends her away. Verse 14, and Abraham arose early in the morning, and he took bread and a leather pouch of water, and he gave them to Hagar. He placed them on her shoulder, and the child, and he sent her away. Bad translation. Vayishalcheha. He sent her. There's a tremendous difference between what Sarah tells Abraham to do and what Abraham ends up doing. Sarah tells Abraham, divorce the son. Send him away, cut all ties. The Hebrew word lishloach is to send with a mission, which means like an emissary, right? If you heard of the term shaliach, an emissary. Send away your son. What Abraham does, he sends her, but the term that's used is an emissary. An emissary is not severing the ties with the person you're sending away. It's an extension of you. In other words, Abraham is sending her away to protect Isaac, but not cutting the ties. And that's ultimately, in a nutshell, the Jewish mission in general. We have to be like Sarah. We have to protect our own identity. And therefore, there's the big question of how much do we stay to ourselves and how much do we integrate with the rest of the world? What's the answer? The answer is both. Once we create Isaac, once we create our own identity that is strong and is solid within our Jewish identity, then we could spread our mission to the rest of the world. But to be able to influence the rest of the world, to be able to interact with the rest of the world, we have to have our own identity. And that's why Sarah's right. First, you have to protect Isaac, and then you can influence the rest of the world. So I think this is nice because, first of all, you're reading the story more subtly. You're understanding the difference in philosophy between Abraham and Sarah, but it also has a practical application to us because it's, in a sense, we are the heirs of both Abraham and Sarah. We have to do both. we have to influence the world the way Abraham wants to do. We also have to protect our own unique and distinct identity of the Jewish people like Sarah wants to do. So we need to do both. And the way to do both is first we make sure we have a strong foundation in our own identity, and then we can spread and we could interact with everybody else to spread the truth of Judaism, the truth of God to the rest of the world. So I thought that was interesting. A lot more to say on this parsha. Just barely touching the surface, but we ran out of time. So God willing, put it on your calendar in good health. We should be here with God's help next year, and we continue the journey.
Rabbi Darren said something similar with Lech Lecha, that the Lech is getting your own flame strong, and the Lecha is going out to others to share it.
Very good, very good. But that's all within Abraham. But here you see Sarah specifically, her job, that wasn't her mission. Even when her mission is not necessarily influence the world. That wasn't Sarah's mission. It was Abraham's. And what's interesting about this reading is that when you read the story literally, it sounds like God is supporting Sarah exclusively. But on more careful analysis, you see that God is not negating what Abraham is saying. God is not negating that Abraham's claim that Yishmael is my son. Right? Verse 13, God says, Ki zarachahu, he is your son as well. And you see, Abraham didn't do what Sarah said. You think he did. He didn't. How do I know? Because Sarah says, garesh, divorce, chase away. What does Abraham do? He sends. Total different word, which has completely different ramifications, right? To send is to be your emissary. It's really extending yourself. And ultimately, that's why both Yishmael and Hagar come back in next week's Parsha. And Avram remarries Hagar, but that's another story.
Why didn't Hashem test Abraham by offering to sacrifice Ishmael rather than offering to sacrifice with Isaac?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, some people say that this is one of the tests. Sending away Ishmael is one of the tests. And in a sense, he did sacrifice Ishmael by sending him away. And therefore, there's a lot of similarities in the narrative between the story of sending away Ishmael and the binding of Isaac. For example, when it says he woke up in the morning, by Ashken Abraham Babakar, he woke up in the morning. Both times, of course he woke up in the morning. What do you think? You think he woke up in the afternoon? No, but both times as he woke up in the morning. And this is a term that's used both in the story of the sending Isaac and sending away Ishmael and sacrificing Isaac. So some people say this is one of the tests. Why specifically was the binding of Isaac? So here you need the Kabbalistic interpretation, where the part of the binding of Isaac is really, it's really mystically speaking, it's really, there's all kinds of interpretations. One interpretation would be ultimately it was harder for him. He was more connected to Isaac in some sense because Isaac was the son of Sarah, and he was obviously very connected to Sarah. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is that mystically speaking, the whole point of the binding of Isaac, as I alluded to earlier, is that Abraham has to connect with Isaac, and some of Isaac's attribute has to go back to Abraham. In other words, it's a big concept, but let me just try to do this very quickly, see if I can do this quickly, get it in and out in under 60 seconds. Why is it the test for Abraham and not the test for Isaac? Why is it, Isaac is sacrificing himself. Why isn't it a text for Isaac? So the simple interpretation is you think because Isaac was a little infant, he didn't know what was going on. But it's not the case. Isaac was 37 years old at the time. Rashi does the math. So why do you say it's the binding of Isaac and not the binding of it's a test? The opening statement is Elokim nisat Avraham. God tested Abraham. Why wasn't this a test for Isaac? The answer is, if you're the attribute of Isaac, it's not a test. Isaac is gvura. Isaac is awe. Isaac is spiritual. Isaac would be very happy to take the first flight out of this physical world and the soul go back to heaven. It's totally fine to do that. For him, it's not a test. That's what he wanted. For him, the test is to stay alive. Okay? Abraham, the test is to have that attribute, that awe and that discipline and that devotion to God to go against your natural inclination for kindness. That's why it's a test for Abraham. In other words, the whole point of test of Isaac is Isaac's attribute. Isaac has to teach Abraham how to do the binding of Isaac. If you sent the binding of Isaac of Yishmael and Abraham, it wouldn't work. Avram cannot do that, cannot perform, would not be able, I think, again, I'm speaking for myself. I think that Abraham would not be able to perform it. The binding of Isaac means the conversation between Isaac and Abraham and some of Isaac's attribute rubs off at Abraham. And that's why there's a beautiful exchange, which seems to be saying nothing, but says everything in the binding of Isaac. You ready? So there's this conversation on the way to the binding of Isaac. There's a conversation between father and son. Now, there's a whole verse here which seems superfluous. You ready? Here it goes. You read it on Rosh Hashanah. Every year we read it on Rosh Hashanah. Okay? Verse 7. And Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and he said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb that you burnt for the burnt offering? So forget about the second half of the verse. What about the first half of the verse? Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and he said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. You don't need this. You could have just started in the second half. Isaac told Abraham, where is the lamb? No, Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and he said, my father. And he said, here am I, my son. And then right before it says, they both went together. And then right after in verse 8, it says, and they both went together. So what are people saying? The conversation of, he says, you're my father, and he says, you're my son. In other words, they start seeing each other. Remember, they're very different. One's all about kindness, one's all about discipline. And they never connected in that sense because their spiritual makeup is completely different. And here on the way to the binding of Isaac, they start seeing that they're related because Abraham sees that he could be like Isaac. And he sees Isaac within himself. He sees that he's the father of Isaac, which means he has the potential for Isaac. And Isaac sees himself as the extension of Abraham. In other words, this mission is not just a test for Abraham, but it's really an opportunity for Isaac and Abraham to do this together. Because it's really a merging of Isaac and Abraham. And that's probably the spiritual Kabbalistic answer. The practical answer is he was, in some sense, it was a greater test to kill Isaac, because Isaac was the son of his beloved wife. Then you get to choose which.
Another practical answer could be that he probably won't even go with him because, first of all, he was older and
Yishmael would run away. Very good answer.
Yeah.
Very good answer. If you try to kill Yishmael, who at that point was not 37 but was 50, I'm not so sure Yishmael would say, "Okay, we're going for the ride." Good point, Vicky. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, but why don't we? Well, we could actually bring Ishmael back to the age of 37, and that would have put Isaac at the age of in the 20s.
No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We know that Yishmael was 14 years older than Isaac. That's clearly in the scripture.
Right.
And Rashi does the math. I don't have the whole calculation offhand, but Rashi does the math that he had to be 37 at the time. If you think about, if you do the math with Sarah's passing, and we'll get into that math next week. But so he's 37 and Yishmael is 51. So if you try to kill Yishmael, he's going to say, "Sorry, Dad, I'm not coming. Go find somebody else."
even if he was when he was younger, he probably wouldn't go.
Would not.
Oh, you know that. Rabbi, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Have a
And,
good
Do you have time for one more question or no?
yes.
Okay, so how do we think about when Lot offers his daughters? Is it just like that's what happened in those times, or there's more to it?
Short answer is yes. He says, look, he's going to protect his guests. What Lot is really what Elisa is alluding to is that the verse says that when the people surround the city and they tell Lot, "Give me these people and we will know them." What does that mean? So they want to kill them, they want to harm them. According to the Medrash, what they want is they want to rape them. The term knowledge is intimacy, is synonymous with intimacy. So he says, you know what? He says, I got two daughters who never knew a man. Take them and spare my guests. So is that the right thing to do or a wrong thing to do? Lot says, because they came to my house. Lot says, these are my guests, I want to protect them. He's sacrificing his children for the guests. Turns out that he doesn't have to because that's, as soon as that happens, the guests get them out of town because the people around the house are overwhelmed with sanverim. They can't really see properly, and Lot gets away with his daughters. Is that the right thing to do? I don't know. I don't know. Probably not. But again, he's in a society. This is like the only mitzvah he was able to do in all of his time in Sedom. Remember, think about it. The only time to do kindness, and therefore he tried to do it fully. And was it balanced? No. Was it the right thing to do? Probably not. But just to put yourself not yourself, But to think about someone in Lot's position who, after all those years of living in Sodom, finally has one opportunity to invite guests. And he's got the Jewish guilt, the guilt from Abraham's house. And Abraham is hospitable, and he sees two people, and he can't hold himself back, so he invites them into his house. And now he's challenged about, and he's challenged that they want to harm the guests. So he goes to the extreme to protect his guests. So I could see why he did it. I don't think it was the right thing. No, I don't think it's the right thing. But psychologically, you can see why he's doing something. He has one opportunity to do a mitzvah. He's going to try to do it. He's going to do it to the extreme. Extreme, I mean, with not considering the moral question of the proposal that he put forth.
Rabbi, there was no paternal relationship there. So it's not so surprising that the girls felt that it was okay to seduce him.
Oh, right. But why you're saying, you're right. Okay, I hear you. The Torah does say that they only did so because they thought they don't want to, but they thought that there's no other men, there's nobody else survived, and therefore they're saving civilization. So I think I don't know that they were doing it because
He didn't see him as a father.
Could be. Okay, I hear you. I'm not disagreeing.
Thank you. It's very interesting.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Zina. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and be well. Thank you.
Thank you.